Our sins are more easily remembered than our good deeds. This was said nearly 2.5 millennia ago by Democritus, and is still true today. Oppenheimer, head of the Manhattan Project, refers to fellow physicists and states that in some sort of crude sense, the physicists have known sin. This is a knowledge which they cannot lose. Nuclear power, to control it at least, feels like a sin. Our sins are remembered over our good deeds. And when I say remembered, I don't just mean our names and what goes down in the books. What I refer to more explicitly is the burden we are going to pass on to the next generation. In our lifetimes, we will grow stronger and stronger as we add more weight to our shoulders. When it comes time for us to pass this weight on to our children, it will be too much for them to bear. With this in mind, let's face our resolution and accept that nuclear power is not our secret weapon in the fight against climate change. So how do we produce energy without producing carbon dioxide? What methods produce the least amount of carbon? The answer is simple. We resort to solar, hydro, and wind power. While nuclear energy may very well emit considerably less carbon dioxide than coal or natural gas, it is trumped by wind power. Now, I know that Oppenheimer isn't a very good source anymore. I mean, he's dead. And I also know that he isn't entirely perfect. So I found myself going even closer and completely perfect. Mark. Not Mark Swanson, but Mark Z. Jacobson. Mark Z. Jacobson is a professor here at Stanford who performed some analysis with fellow professor colleagues. According to his findings, nuclear power results in 9 to 25 times more carbon emissions than wind power. This is in part due to emissions from uranium refining and transport and reactor construction, in part due to longer time required to construct a nuclear plant compared with a wind farm, and in part due to greater loss of soil carbon due to the greater loss of vegetation resulting from covering the ground with nuclear facilities relative to wind turbine towers, which are pretty skinny and don't cover much ground. Carbon is not the only contributor to climate change. Let's think about this very logically. Our planet is heating up, and that's bad. Waste from nuclear reactors emits heat. Nuclear energy helps to heat the planet, and is thus bad. Let's also recognize that radioactive material is a form of pollution. Let's also recognize that we can't be sure of the extent of the harm that nuclear reactors pose. Einstein once said, nature shows us only the tail of the lion, but there is no doubt in my mind that the lion belongs with it, even if he cannot reveal himself to the eye all at once because of its huge dimension. We shouldn't pull on the lion's tail until we know how sharp its teeth are. The World Nuclear Industry Status Report of 2013 was published last month on the 16th, revealing a growth of over 1.2 gigawatts of nuclear power during 2012 globally. It seems like a great number and all until it's compared with the 32 gigawatts of solar growth in the same time. In fact, the report indicates that the nuclear industry is in a decline in nearly every category and in nearly every country. The nuclear renaissance is over, and it's been in decline since 2006. We have to stop dreaming and start to act. Nuclear is not the answer. It's not some sort of Moses here to bring us to an imaginary promised land or paradise. Nuclear energy will act to bring us away from the paradise we're already given, the earth we are currently abusing. Our earth was powered by solar energy for billions of years, and it was a paradise then. It's time to stop deviating from what we know works. It's time to go back to solar and other renewable energies. Let's look away from heavy radioactives and turn to solar, hydro, and wind power to wash and blow away the weight we have to bear and eventually pass on. Let's recognize that the information I'm presenting to you today clearly suggests that nuclear power is not an indispensable energy source in the fight against climate change.
Mark Linus, author of multiple books regarding climate change and sustainability, said in his book Nuclear 2.0 that there is no prospect whatsoever of us running out of coal or need any other fossil fuel in time to save the climate. Global coal supplies will last 112 years at current production. This means that time is not running out for the forces working to destroy our environment, but time is running out for the environment itself. As CO2 levels continue to rise, we can expect the Earth's climate to rise 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, a fact that Linus himself has molded a book around. According to Linus, a mere 3 to 4 degrees change would lead to global collapse in food production due to crop failure, total disappearance of glacial ice in the Andes and the Alps, extreme desertification and drought, and rising sea levels that would destroy low-lying coastal cities. Since fossil fuel supplies aren't expected to expire soon, there will be little economic reason to replace coal plants with alternative energy sources. Therefore, we need an energy source that can be economically viable, practical for all locations, low in carbon production, and powerful enough to satisfy global energy consumers. When it comes to money, things are simple. Nuclear energy is the only alternative energy that can and has been produced on large scale while providing low cost per unit energy. The National Education Administration and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which are both U.S. Government agencies, have said that nuclear in the United States would cost at most $1.72 per megawatt hour, while wind costs at least $16 per megawatt hour, and solar at least $14.82 per megawatt hour. Huge difference. Second, location. Nuclear plants can be constructed nearly anywhere. You need serious water resources for hydroelectric. You can't perform it in a desert, for example. You need intense sunlight for solar cells, and you need wind for wind turbines. You can't import wind, sunlight, or rivers, but you can import uranium. This is without mentioning the land that's required for solar or wind farms. Places like Germany have no more land to give for wind or solar farms. 13 clean terawatts of energy from wind, solar, and biofuels would roughly take up the size of the U.S., and it would require 17 terawatts to power the world. Next. Nuclear power plants produce a very small, almost negligible amount of CO2 themselves, and yes, during most construction, but not during transportation, as you only refuel a power plant every year and a half. And no CO2 is given off as a result of fission. We also have to include the fact that harmful chemicals are included in the manufacture of solar energy, solar panels. Right, lastly, according to Greenpeace and its coalition with the GWEC, with the absolutely most optimistic scenarios, wind grows by 1,500% and solar by 9,500% by 2030. In that case, wind power would generate 22% of global electricity and solar 17%. France currently gets 78% of its power from nuclear, and the same feat could be performed in any first world country where power is being used the most. Therefore, I would say that nuclear power is the most viable option for us today.
All right, could you speak to the credibility of Mark Linus, please?
Mark Linus has been an author of many different books regarding climate change.
His qualifications for his nuclear.
He used to be anti-nuclear, but after looking through all the facts and learning more about nuclear, he changed sides.
And could you please explain the first clear error that came in the cover pages of his book Nuclear 2.0? Quote, I had entirely overlooked the world's most abundant source of low carbon power, referring to nuclear power. But that's not nuclear, it's hydro. According to the 2012 edition of the IEA Key World Energy Statistics, nuclear generated 2,756 terawatts, while hydro generated 3,516.
The current amount of nuclear power being used doesn't speak specifically to its efficiency and its potential on the scale. Most people right now are, like, let's take Austria for example. And Germany, after Fukushima, they decided to shut down all their power plants. So it's a brash and irrational decision. People are hearing about these accidents, thinking that it's the end of the world, and thinking that nuclear would automatically mean nuclear bomb.
The question was more pointed at the credibility of Linus, because again, he makes an error claiming that nuclear power provides 15% of global electricity, but that's not even right. Even in 2010, when he's claiming the facts, it was at a higher point than it is now. The percentage was at 12.9, and of course it's declined substantially after that, again, according to an IEA report.
The IEA report that I'm looking at right now says that nuclear and hydro both produce 16% of global electricity production.
I was referring to the nuclear.
Sorry, yeah, nuclear and hydro are producing the same amount of power that we do. But what can be said from this is that it's a wash. 1 year hydro may be producing more power than nuclear, or vice versa. The point isn't how much power is currently produced, but what can be produced. And fact of the matter is that hydro and other alternative sources cannot be produced on large scale. You saw you heard the Greenpeace estimates, and those were dismal. Look at France right now; the 78% of their power is being produced by nuclear. That can be done by any of those.
And you say first world country, but we're looking at the world here and preserving our world, our planet. And there are many third world countries and not first world countries, but in the gray area. So how would you propose helping them out?
Time's up.
Okay, so for 50 years, nuclear power stations have produced 3 products which only a lunatic could want. Bomb explosive plutonium, lethal radioactive waste, and electricity, so dear that it has to be subsidized. They leave future generations with the task, most of the cost, of making safe sites that have been polluted halfway to eternity. And this is by James Buchanan. With this in mind, I'd like to raise the question, do we really want to dump all of our problems on our future? Is that the correct way we want to go? I mean, I don't think so. We really shouldn't. Consequently, the concept of nuclear power is a deceptively enticing choice, because many tend to automatically quantify the enormous energy gain by a single uranium pellet as a win-win situation with no cons. So my first contention pertains to the greenhouse gases that are released from the mining and processing of uranium. So in order to mine uranium ore, hundreds of diesel trucks are needed per site to transfer the ore to the milling factory. Usually on average, and this is from the Uranium Association of America, on average, one milling site from the actual ore site is roughly 100 miles. So how do you transport that? You need diesel trucks. And so what do diesel trucks use? Diesel trucks use diesel. They're not made for environmental concerns. They're not made for efficiency. They're just made to carry out what they have to do, which is to just bring uranium to the mill. So these trucks and cranes, right, have capacities ranging from 500 to 3,000 tons per day. And so on average, and all of these facts are from the Uranium Association of America, which is a pro-nuclear place, so obviously it's not a biased source against them. But on average, they receive 15 million tons of shipments per year, on average. And on average, the CO2 emission of each truck is roughly 10 kilograms of CO2 per trip, or no, per 9 miles, or per gallon, which each truck has an efficiency of 9 miles per gallon. So if we keep that in mind, a 100-mile trip would require roughly 11 gallons, right? And 11 times 10, because that's the amount of CO2, is 110 kilograms of CO2. And this is just per truck. Each truck makes roughly 5 to 6 trips every day. And it's obviously not working all year long, but it's by the weekly, right? So if we add this up, you're going to get over 50,000 tons of kilograms per mining facility, and this is just per facility. So there are many facilities across the world. So when you add that up, it's a really, really big number. Okay, so we're only talking about the transportation in that sense, but there's also the cranes, there's also the heavy machinery, the drills, and all that. They also use diesel. So we have to factor in those kind of uranium things. But on the contrary, when it comes to wind energy, I'm going to be picking on wind energy because it's probably one of the most efficient forms of energy or utilization. So when it comes to wind energy, whose average CO2 emission per turbine, and this includes construction, shipment, operation, and disposal, is roughly 20,000 kilograms of CO2 per turbine. All right, that's per turbine. If you compare that to the number of the amount of CO2 from each truck, it's just, you can't compare it. Wind energy beats it by tenfold. So, in addition to the disposal of waste materials and construction site machinery, you also have to worry about where you're going to put that. So, they call it mill tailings. Tailings are the processed ore that is radioactive, but not necessarily, you can't actually use it for energy. All right, I'm going to skip over my next two pretensions. Anyways, I'd like to address Harrison's point, saying that that the location of nuclear power plants can be anywhere. I beg to differ. I don't see nuclear power plants in the middle of the ocean, whereas wind turbines can be placed offshore, and so that's out of land. Didn't find that long. Thank you, Annie.
First of all, Ani, I'd like to address your, ask you about your source, about how you got to that electricity about wind generation. Because I'm looking at an EIA source from 2013 that the aggregate for renewable energy is only 218,788 megawatts versus the aggregate for all nuclear energy, which is 769,331 megawatts. So that's a 350% increase over all of renewables combined.
I was talking about CO2.
Okay, CO2
Same
emissions.
this way.
Oh, sorry.
All right.
Okay,
Well,
yeah, no doubt.
I'll continue on with megawatt generation. So that's a 350% increase from just one source of energy, which is nuclear, versus all of renewable combined, which is hydro, wind, geothermal, and solar. And if you look at each individual source, it's even more ridiculous. If you compare nuclear with wind, wind generates 140,089 megawatts, which is 550% increase for nuclear over wind. Geothermal at near 16,791 megawatts, which is 4,600% increase over geothermal for nuclear. And solar, which includes both concentrated solar power and photovoltaics, only generates 4,342 megawatts. So that's a 177,000% increase for nuclear over solar. So you're talking about how there's a 9 to 25% increase for the CO2 emissions from nuclear versus any other sources. I'm looking at a difference of 551,000 megawatts that all the renewables combined as opposed to nuclear. So how are we going to make up that 551,000 megawatts difference? We're going to have to subsidize that with coal and other fossil fuels. So in the long run, you're looking at less energy produced by the renewable energies versus all the other nuclear energies combined. And now you're talking about the nuclear CO2 emissions. I'm looking from another source, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel, that's the acronym. IPCC, which is a UN organization focusing on energy. And it states that nuclear produces 12 grams of CO2 emission per kilowatt hour versus renewable, which produces 147 grams per kilowatt hour. So I'm not sure where you got those information from. That came from the latest session. And in terms of the acreage per source of energy, I'm looking at the nuclear, the largest current wind source is producing only 1,320 megawatts with 490 turbines over 9,000 acres. And the largest, you're talking about the wind turbines that can be placed over water. The largest one so far and planned is rated at 504 megawatts, which has only 140 turbines over 36,000 acres. So with those combined, I'm not sure if you guys would like to live with a bunch of wind farms in your backyard, especially with the low noise coming in. That's why Germany has all those protests about that. Versus the largest nuclear power plant, which is Kawasaki Kararu nuclear power plant, which is rated at 8,212 megawatts. And yeah.
I start off by saying you gave a lot of numbers about energy production, but I'm pretty sure our resolution was about environmental impacts, right? So I'm just wondering if you have any facts about that energy production linked to the...
Yes, I'm basing my energy production. There was a difference of 551,000 megawatts that your renewable energy cannot meet to the nuclear power expectation. So how are we going to get those 551,000 megawatts? You can't have any more renewable energy from what it already has. So you're going to have to replace those 551,000 megawatts from other fossil fuels, which includes the harmful coal and natural gas and that kind of stuff. So you're going to get CO2 emissions from those aspects. Versus nuclear, where you already have that big of enough gap in there, so you don't have to account for that.
Okay, so, I mean, I see what you're saying, but you're also forgetting the fact that we can always expand the industry, right? And expand the okay, just make sure. And then, I'll say one more thing and then you can ask your thing, but You said all those facts about like megawatt hours
Yeah.
per thing. Can you just restate the source thing?
I got my sources from EIA, which is the Environmental Information Administration, and the IPCC, which is a UN organization related to power.
So it's based on those facts that you presented, is nuclear energy more climate friendly than wind?
Yes, because the overall life cycle you're looking at from cradle to grave, which means the materials that were used in construction to energy sources during its time of commissioning to the leftovers from when it's decommissioned. That's the aggregate of the total CO2 emissions.
Okay. I feel like you completely skipped over the whole mining and reprocessing.
I like to point out that mining and reprocessing has nothing to do with climate change, that they affect the environment, but climate change is not affected by that.
I don't agree with that because all these diesel trucks, they emit CO2, which contributes to the
Let's look at
climate
your
change.
statistics on CO2. In the United States, there are 104 total reactors, and let's say that each reactor uses 200 tons per reactor, and each reactor has to be filled in 1.5 years. So let's say all these sources have to be placed in every single, just like at once. So all concentrated in one day. You have a total of 31,200 tons. And so let's just say that each truck can only carry 1 ton, which is barely any. So you have 31,200 trucks on the road, and if you have 3,100 trucks on the road with miles per gallon, like 20 miles per gallon, you're only getting 3,120 gallons of.
Factor in construction.
So the information presented clearly shows that nuclear is more climate friendly. I'm sorry, that renewable sources are more climate friendly than nuclear. And when asked about the emissions nuclear energy produces, the other side failed to consider the construction emissions as well as the actual transportation emissions. Furthermore, if you take a graph of all the U.S. or a map of all the U.S. nuclear reactors and you overlay it with all the carbon emissions from the U.S., you see a concentration of carbon emissions over every single nuclear reactor. Granted, why don't we look at the coal? All right, so we look at the coal and you take a map of all the worst coal plants, any that emit over the regulatory limit in the past 10 years. There are none on the West Coast. There are none in California, and there are none in the state of Washington. There are 3 nuclear reactors in total in those 3 states, and there's a concentration of carbon emissions over each of them. This just goes to show that nuclear reactors, even when they're constructed over the course of 10 years, you can still see the carbon emissions, where there is no coal plant to blame them. It's just the nuclear that will take the blame. Also, note that the other party failed to focus on emissions and focus more on the energy provided by nuclear. While nuclear may provide more energy than what renewables currently do, they are still harming the environment, and the focus needs to be the environment, and the focus of the resolution is the environment. And the only thing that should be brought to the table in this debate is how the environment is affected. Energy should not be a factor.
Okay, so Mike is talking a lot now about how nuclear may be producing more energy, but it's not kind enough for the environment. We can't just magically revert to becoming cave people, not using any more power. According, again, using the Greenpeace's most optimistic scenario for wind and solar growth. Again, solar, that's 9,500% growth. Still, renewables would only be producing 39% of the global energy. Now, if you don't factor in nuclear, the only other power that you can realistically generate would come from fossil fuels. That's 61%. 61% from fossil fuels. That's going to be a hell of a lot more than any CO2 released during construction of nuclear plants. So the construction itself is negligible in comparison. And you also have to consider that you have to perform construction too for these solar and wind farms. How else are you going to get land from them but to bulldoze through wildlife? Or put them on the ocean. Also, in order to create solar panels, you have to use a lot of harmful chemicals, things like mercury and arsenic. And those chemicals stay here forever. Unlike nuclear waste, which is not half-lives, and eventually they will break. I'd like to mention now the Zwentendorf plant in Austria. It's a perfect representation of what would happen if we only use renewable. They spent 1.2 million euros putting solar photovoltaic cells on a nuclear plant. And instead of using the nuclear plant itself, and only produced 0.003% of the power that the plant would produce. And they called it a green alternative. That energy would have to be supplemented.
It's a holistic process, right? So we have to look at every single step of the way. Like you guys look at the construction of the wind turbines, we're going to look at the construction of the nuclear power plant, and also like the covering of the materials being in the power plant.
As well as all the time it takes to build that nuclear power plant and the amount of energy and emissions you're going to be, I guess, using and putting out in that time and that specific area. Speaking of emissions and decays, you said that eventually our waste will go away. Well, that eventually is hundreds of thousands, millions of years away. Now, we can't really be looking that far in the future. We need to focus on climate now. If we don't focus on climate now, we're not going to get there. It won't matter that it's going to be gone in a million, 100,000 years. I mean, we're not going to live to be a million unless some magic happens, but we can't be relying on magic. And I also agree that we can't switch to no energy, but we can't be adding more. We're digging a deeper hole that we're eventually going to have to fill.
Right, and so there's other options such as space solar, right? That'll last for thirds. The sun is supposed to last for a few more billion years. So that's definitely a plausible effect, but obviously I'm not trying to mention that there are other forms besides renewables, fossil fuels, or
Okay, I'd like to address that. You said that we didn't take into account that material cost and construction. So the definition for total life cycle CO2 emission is that cradle grave cycle, which means that the construction materials are being accounted for, as well as the transportation to and from the source to power. And so based off of that, the CO2 emissions still 12 grams per kilowatt hour versus all renewable 137 grams per kilowatt hour. I'm not taking into account for that all those 9,000 acres added together, they do mean something. Versus near 36 acres for nuclear power plants. And so I'm not, and also you're saying that we're only talking about megawatt steam generator versus climate change. I'm contending that with those 551,000 megawatts that's being generated by, that's the difference between nuclear and renewable energy. We're going to get those 551,000 from all the fossil fuels. So those fossil fuels have to generate CO2 emissions.
And what I'm saying is you can't assume what you don't know. Democritus also left us with the advice, believe not everything, but only what is proved. The former is foolish, the latter that of a sensible man. Fools are shaped by gifts of chance, but those who understand these things by the gifts of wisdom. I would hope that you're not a fool, here. And also pertaining to your acreage, with wind farms don't actually take up that acreage. One wind farm could be, or one turbine could be here, and here, and here, and here. But I wouldn't say my pens are covering the entire paper, whereas a nuclear plant would.
you can still put stuff between them.
So,
So the con side of this argument is that gained the upper hand as seen by the clear and explicit analysis that still hasn't been addressed by Stanford University professor Mark C. Jacobson. And I mean, he noted that nuclear power results in 9 to 25 times more carbon emissions than wind power. And then this was also further in detail through the analysis of the process of uranium mining, which also, I mean, you guys are talking a lot about power, but nothing about like how you got that power, where's that power coming from, the process to get that power. And so all these statistics were from the Uranium Producers of America, so they're all pretty legit. It's also be noted that a lot of your evidence is like circumstantial assumptions, and so we feel that we're trying to address your claims, but at the same time, there are many, many other options besides the ones that you propose, and so that's why we can't, obviously solve the problem immediately. And then nuclear energy is in a decline, as noted by my partner, and so this finite source will eventually cease to power the world, and so we have to look to more renewable ways, such as wind and solar. And so the carbon footprint that we leave now will not affect us, may not affect our next generation, but it will affect our the generations after. And so it's really important that we really leave our mark in a good way. And so the best way to do that is by switching to wind and solar. As you can see, transportation, building costs, building emissions are much, much, much lower than those of nuclear power plants. And so with that, I'd like to end that note saying that the con side would really give more explicit evidence, and I feel that we have
Alright, so first of all, I'd like to ask how you made up that we were assuming things, because we have hard facts right here that you do have an energy gap of half a million megawatts, which you're going to have to use from fossil fuels. That's not an assumption, that's a given. From those 551,000 megawatts, you're going to be producing a lot more carbon emissions. And you're saying that we're not accounting for the material costs and construction, like I already reiterated a lot of times before. We did with the life cycle CO2 emissions for the construction and operation costs, which includes fuel costs, the transportation from the source to power plants. So you're just seeing things over and over again. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that once again, the renewable is 147 grams per kilowatt hour for CO2 emission versus nuclear, which is 12 kilowatt hour. That's a hard fact. That's not an assumption. And that's from the EIA. That's a 1,200% increase over nuclear power. So I'm not sure how you're getting those CO2 emissions from. You're saying that we need a 10-on future to build more renewables, but we have nuclear right now, and it's this far advanced that it's producing this much more electricity over all the other renewables. How can we rely on future generation that are problems right now? So with that in mind, I'd like to say that nuclear does have a lot larger production of energy that can be used to solve our global climate change that renewables simply doesn't have the caliber to meet up with. And so I'm ending with the note that nuclear is simply a much better viable option than all the other renewables combined.
For peace, President Eisenhower said, "The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. The capability already proved is here, now, today. Who can doubt if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, that this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, and economic usage?" That was in 1952. Yet, 60 years since, we still produce most of our energy from coal. The nuclear energy opposition has a point. Radiation can cause death. Even so, only 3 major accidents have occurred in 14,500 cumulative reactor years from the commercial power plants in 32 countries, according to the World Nuclear Association, 2 of which did not result in any immediate deaths. The IAEA and the NRC and other organizations have managed to enforce high regulations concerning radiation, such that individuals receive only low-dose radiation in case of an accident. This has not proven to cause harmful health effects unless exceeded the 100 millisievert. To give you an idea of how unlikely this is, spending 2 weeks in the Fukushima exclusion zone will only expose you to 1 millisievert. On the other hand, normal year background dose is approximately 4 millisievert. This data was taken from the NRC and the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. It is important to compare the risks of nuclear power to that of other forms of energy production. In the entire energy industry between 1969 and 2000, there were 1,870 severe accidents, resulting in 5 or more deaths each. Chernobyl was the only one out of them that took place in the nuclear industry. The energy industry also had 81,258 deaths in this time frame, only 31 of which were directly linked to the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, according to the World Nuclear News. The pro-nuclear scientists argue that the benefits outweigh the risks. For starters, nuclear energy does not produce CO2, since all a reactor does is generate heat, turning water into steam. This allows it to battle climate change and subsidize the energy demand. On the other hand, Mark Lennon's book 2.0 refers to the total volume of all nuclear waste filling a football field of 15 yards in depth. This is nowadays. It is also important to consider that the spent nuclear fuel can be stored for 60 years instead of 30, which was the limit, after the license of the plant expires, according to the Court of Appeals petition to the review on the orders of the NRC binding order. Gas reactors will also decrease nuclear waste, since the waste can be reused. According to the IAEA Division of Public Information, this technology already exists in prototypes. There are 12 experimental gas reactors and 6 commercial prototypes. The Russian Federation has a currently operating BN-600 gas reactor and is working on a BN-800. Other countries working on this technology are China, France, and Japan. Although nuclear energy has its flaws, the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. Nuclear is the most efficient energy source when looking at energy gain per mass as well as cost. Nuclear energy releases no carbon into the atmosphere and can easily generate enough energy to satisfy our needs.
They cause destruction and fatality of life. Many events have occurred where people have become irradiated and died from radiation dosage. Some examples of these events can be found at Bikini Atoll. If people have issues with water, food, and reproduction, the Bravo nuclear bomb test caused damage to the bodies and damage to newborn babies. After the Bravo shot, everything went wrong. One citizen of Bikini Atoll talks about their experiences after the Bravo shot. Quote, I noticed that not everything was right when I took the slope. The arrow roots that grew before were gone. Coconut trees were bearing green and yellow nuts from the same tree, very unusual. The water changed color when we cooked our foods. We tried to change it many times, but the same thing kept happening. On occasion, we found some of our fish had thyroid problems. Small hardened nodules were found in fish meals. These were very hard to crack, but after opening them up and tossing them in the water changed to the colors of the rainbow. End quote. After staying on the island, citizens developed thyroid cancer due to the release of iodine-131. Lesions on the neck and blisters in their mouth from eating the radiated food. Mothers died when giving birth, and those that didn't gave birth to quote jellyfish babies. End quote. Babies born without any bones and transparent skin. These babies died within 2 hours. Most indigenous groups on the atolls gave up reproduction and have died out. Those who were forced to leave the atolls never got used to the new life and most died out also. Also, over 250,000 U.S. officers and soldiers were exposed to radiation. On the hand of nuclear reactors, all major nuclear reactor incidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, were the cause of human error. In the 3 Mile Island incident, inadequate training caused people to not recognize the loss of fluid, and the operator thought there was too much fluid, releasing even more fluid. In Chernobyl, a test was run by the government using conditions that would obviously cause the reactor to fail. For example, the reactor outputs high power levels, but the test called for low power levels, 780 megawatts. This caused a huge cloud of radioactive material to fall across Europe, irradiating 40% of Europe and caused 340,000 people to lose their lives. Fukushima was an accident waiting time. Says CNN, quote, TEPCO admitted for the first time on October 12, 2012, that it had failed to take strong measures to prevent disasters for fear of inviting lawsuits or protests against nuclear plants. TEPCO is not a U.S. company, meaning that it is not under the regulation of the U.S. NRC. This means that another accident may occur unless TEPCO takes great measures to upgrade its infrastructure. Moreover, $8.5 billion has been spent on nuclear reactor accidents in the U.S. $520 billion has been spent on building all nuclear reactors in the U.S. $5.5 billion is spent on building up the nuclear arsenal. Over $11 billion came from taxes. The U.S. congressional budget for general electricity through 2012 is only $56 billion a year. Final point to me is that the price of uranium fluctuates. Forbes says, quote, the price of uranium, which has hovered nearly $10 a pound per year, spiked to $138 in 2007. If we start relying on uranium as the number one source of energy, and the price fluctuates like it did in 2007, we'll be forced to pay a hefty amount for import uranium, increasing the amount of the U.S. exports.
So, you spend half of your speech talking about bikini and the accident. What does that have to do with nuclear energy?
Well, the accident released radiation, which caused all those symptoms, and since there might be another human error that would cause a major nuclear incident, this will cause radiation spread, doing the same thing to the people at Bikini Atoll, but all over the world.
Do you consider this human error only nuclear? Only nuclear? Like, I mean, it can happen in other places.
There hasn't been. Well, yeah, there hasn't been like radiation fallout from the coal. Question I want to ask you is, you said there are high regulations, but that's only in the U.S. It's not in other countries.
EIA has a law in documents that it tests for it in
Anyway, another question which I want to ask is that you said there's not a lot of waste from the nuclear reactors, and the waste is securely kept, but that's not true because waste is still leaking out of the Vermont energy, generation, and WR into the environment, and no one's doing anything about it.
So consider that if you did something about it, that you would increase the danger of it, and it's not considered to be that bad as to
So what you're saying is that we should let the leakage continue until it eats up all the environment?
No, I believe we should probably come up with a better solution.
But you said that if we try to stop it, it would be even worse.
Yes, therefore we must come up with a better solution, and the government is in charge actually of the nuclear waste, and it is supposed
Okay, so I'm going to start this by referring back to the resolution. The resolution states that the benefits of nuclear power outweigh the risks. So it's important to break that down into the two questions that it's asking: what are the benefits and what are the risks, and do the benefits outweigh the risks? So first, starting with benefits, it's important to look at what are the problems that nuclear energy is solving. One is the energy crisis, or not the energy crisis, sorry, the climate crisis, climate change. And nuclear is really the only feasible energy source to replace coal at this point in time. Because wind and solar have higher costs of manufacturing per energy, per energy gain, as well as leaving a larger carbon footprint with the cost of making, or with the making of the material. And then there's also the problem that the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining. And they also take up a lot of space in comparison to nuclear energy per area, like energy per area. I want to refer back to something you said about at the very beginning of your speech. You were talking about the bikini experiment and talking about radiation, that sort of thing. Like, although radiation, it does come out of a nuclear reactor, it's only on the scale of 0.09 microsieverts, which is really within 15 miles of the nuclear power plant. And in no time can a nuclear reactor blow up as a bomb, because the uranium is only enriched to about 5%, as opposed to a nuclear bomb, which is enriched on the order of 90%. Okay, so looking at the other side of the resolution, the lack of risks. As Maria mentioned, there have only been 1,870 severe accidents, severe meaning resulting in 5 or more deaths, according to the World Nuclear News in the energy industry. And the only one in the time period of 1969 to 2000 was Chernobyl. And it's also been the only what's considered a severe accident by the World Nuclear News since then as well. So there were only 31 deaths related to or linked directly to Chernobyl, and the ones that resulted afterwards, although statistically may seem relevant, the uncertainty is too high to draw any conclusive numbers. Also, when Maria was talking about the IAEA, when you asked the question about the regulations in other countries, the IAEA is an international organization run by the UN, so all of the countries are subject to the rules that are set up by the IAEA. Some of the rules, or some of the regulatory rules for the United States specifically specify the reactor must meet a 1 in 10,000 year organic capacity, meaning that in reactor years, which is like equivalent to one reactor lasts X number of years. In 10,000 years, there can only be one organic incident. Not a design to see this, some pushing for 1 in a million organic incidents. And likely to be built in the next decade. It's hypothesized that there will be one. The final thing that I'm going to leave you with is going back to the radiation chart that I mentioned earlier. Living within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, or anywhere even closer than 50 miles, will not give you any more radiation than taking a flight from New York to LA, or eating a banana even.
Undoubtedly, there are some benefits to nuclear power. Power output generated by a nuclear reactor greatly surpasses the output of other energy systems like natural gas, hydroelectric, or coal. It is also true that once reactors are operational running, it uses less pollution than many situations power sources like natural gas and coal. Yet these advantages come with drawbacks. As opposed to other forms of energy, nuclear reactors create byproducts that can harm all forms of life. The back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is mostly comprised of spent fuel rods, contains fission products that emit beta and gamma radiation, as well as actinides like uranium and plutonium that emit alpha particles. Radioactive waste contains the most utility companies may claim that they adequately dispose of this hazardous material, but with closure of Yucca Mountain Repository, many already have a permanent solution to the waste management problem. The Vermont Yankee reactor is no exception. It has been leaking radioactive tritium into surrounding groundwater since early 2010. A study done by the EPA has shown that the water stream of the plant has risen to 20,000 picocuries per liter, which is the federal limit for radiation exposure to drinking water. U.S. reactor sites trying to anyone with this problem, making this a global issue, thus proliferation of nuclear power may very well result in contamination of people and wildlife who live in relatively close vicinity of the plant. A more abstract issue that's associated with nuclear power is the very issue of power itself. Energy is the fabric of our everyday lives. It's the very backbone of our modern society. Increasingly, everything we do relies more and more on energy. The most rudimentary points, energy is that which enables us to socialize with friends from afar and watch sports events, experience them like we really in stands, and even help aid this research program. So if we want future generations to be able to continue this upward trend in power consumption, we will need to develop energy systems that utilize a limitless source of power. In this case, nuclear is simply not the answer. The IAEA reports that current global uranium ore deposits will last us 500 more years in nuclear energy use. Generation 4 reactors and no countries implementing new processing, this prediction is only likely to increase. Even so, there will come a day where we will have exhausted all our uranium ore reserves and reprocessed all our nuclear waste. Nuclear power is immense and long-lasting, but is far from limitless. It runs the risk of inevitable failure. So let's do the right thing now for future generations. The next $500 billion would have gone towards the next non-renewable energy source, put into something that's really sustainable. Thank you.
By saying, let's take all this money that we're spending on nuclear energy and put it towards something else, what is your suggestion?
We could bring more of other alternative energy sources, solar and wind. We understand that those are things that people are in the area, and we're hoping that we can be able to accommodate more fossil power. Obviously, we have to get some goals to accommodate the losses of other energy sources. You said that meltdowns, obviously explosives, and but can they also like dirty bomb where say a pipe in hydrogen plants and so there's a meltdown already in the reactor and explosion release some radioactive material the reactor?
Yes, but there are actually the requirement for nuclear reactors at this point is to be passively safety.
Passive safety.
Yeah, to have passive safety to allow them to be safe for 72 hours after failure. So that's sufficient time for evacuation to occur within what's considered radiation.
But there would still be an area where people would not be able to get it.
Dependent on the accident, but of course this is only one in every 10,000 years, according to the NRC, and according to utility requirements, they're actually higher. It's one in 1,000 years.
A reactor, that's the reactor you think. What do you think will happen as developing countries will begin developing programs? Because obviously, the nuclear reactors are designed to be fail-safe, but what happens in Chernobyl is an actual human error where one of the operators did something wrong, and that caused a huge catastrophe.
Well, it's hard to say. It's not something that I can make an educated guess on, just because we haven't put nuclear reactors in third world countries. Like we could do it as the United States puts a nuclear reactor and sends their own people, but as for right now, I wouldn't suggest putting them in third world countries and having uneducated people running necessarily running that.
I mean, like as developing countries become going to.
Well, if they have the education and capacity, then it's
do you think that a
preparation for the summary. Yeah, no problem.
You've addressed the fact that these accidents occur, and it is important to clarify that we learn from them. There have been two important forms related to both accidents, Chernobyl form in 2003 and 2004, and the Fukushima recommendation by the NRC. Also against the weapons, there is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which clearly has helped reduce the weapons, at least in America, and that would satisfy if we actually decriminalize all the weapons. As to the risk of cancer, it is stated in the 1986 policy statement that risk of cancer or prompt fatality posed to an individual in the vicinity of a nuclear plant must be below 0.1 of all risks from other causes to which the population is exposed. And the fourth generation technology would also increase the non-proliferation treaty, since it is not going to separate the plutonium from the rest.
Said that you learned from it, but how much time did you spend learning from it until like full world radiated from all of your disaster that you caused? And also another question that was stated is that Chernobyl and nuclear reactors just like that are meant to be stopped. So if you want to move it or you want to take it apart to a nuclear reactor, you can't do that without having a Chernobyl incident. So it's sort of hard to do that. Also, you said that within your reactor only has a low dosage of radiation, but the NAS in 2003 found out that a low dose of radiation could cause breast cancer. So low dose radiation also does something, it just doesn't make anything. Also, nuclear reactors are really toxic. Like basically, they come with radiation, and radiation is deadly to all life, not just to us. So in the future, our whole planet will be destroyed from life.
My question is, when you were talking about low dose radiation causing cancer, so do you suggest like avoiding bananas and flan and those sorts of low radiation, because even though as well, because that because of the exposure
If you want low dose,
so not towards So you're saying you want to stay away from dental x-rays and CAT scans? It's not a problem here. or it has to boost the use of nuclear weapons. But that's the next that's how we Me and Maria and Bob, both Jake and the resolution states that the benefits of nuclear power as a nuclear energy and non-nuclear weapons outweigh the risks. So I feel that the opposing side failed to break down what the problems of nuclear energy are and instead focused on what the problems of nuclear bombs and nuclear bomb testing are, especially in regards to the Cuban incidents of the Cuban testing. I believe that the benefits of nuclear power do outweigh the risks because we do need to find a solution to replace our coal and our natural gas plants. And as of right now, wind and solar can't serve as a base load to replace the coal. So nuclear has to be the answer unless someone else can come up with something that does not currently exist. The risks are very rare. It's very low consequence and high risk. No, low probability, and high risk. And if you look at other the rest of the energy industry, 81,250 deaths in the energy industry between 1969 and 2000, and only 31 are attributed to the nuclear industry. And I think that number alone proves that nuclear energy is a concern.
Although you said that accidents in nuclear energy is high risk of devastating eliminations, even if there is no accident, which that is happening, it can still harm the local environment, people living there, the environment, smoke and breathing, waste, also, it also takes the amount of money that we put into reactors in the U.S. is $5 billion, and that's money that we could have been putting towards other forms of energy development that is more efficient or benefits.
Great. Thank you very much.
Of course, if nuclear energy isn't sustainable, when finite resources are consumed, the amount decreases. Clearly, consumption of the resource is unsustainable. Didn't we learn that with fossil fuels? Anonymous. Now, an anonymous quote, how is this even credible? Couldn't I have just made this up to make my case? Sure. But anyone who knows the physics should agree. After all, it's the second law of thermodynamics restated and applied. And this brings us to our first contention. Uranium is finite. The more uranium we use, the less we'll have, and one day we won't have any. What I'm saying is that nuclear energy is not abundant, and it is certainly not abundant relative to alternative options. The resolution scope focuses on the world, not just the US and Europe. Developing countries need energy too, so let's focus on getting them energy for a minute. We're going to look at the source of energy first. How much does water cost? How much do sun rays cost? And how much does it cost for a breeze? And how much does it cost for uranium? Free, 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 and $40 if you look on Amazon. But that amount is not nearly enough to sustain enough to power anything, nor is it even enriched, and that's a costly process as well. See, renewable sources are available to us for free, and in such abundance, infinite in a relative sense. Basic economics outlines that as supply increases, cost and demand decreases, making renewable cheap and abundant. Nuclear energy just isn't comparable for one simple reason being that uranium is bought and sold. It isn't just there to use. Alright, we can look at this two ways, in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, establishment and startup, nuclear is trumped by almost everything. Coal and natural gas are already established and can be expanded upon. If we're looking for new forms of energy, I could list a whole bunch of other sources of energy that are cheaper than nuclear. Nuclear is just too expensive to start up for developing countries. In the long term, well, uranium as apple energy is still finite. Nothing has changed in the last few seconds, and that won't change for quite a long time. So possibly forever unless we find a way to manufacture uranium. And in preparing for this debate, I'm sure both parties looked at a bunch of graphs and charts detailing the cost of nuclear energy. And there are many ways, some of which are biased, to measure the cost. However, lifetime levelized electric generation cost is the most effective. The problem with this measurement, and pretty much every other measurement, is that they don't consider the cost of mining, milling, enrichment, interest on the loans that these private companies have to take out to pay for reactors, and other such associated costs with these particular energies. When these are factored in, nuclear is not as cheap as it is portrayed to be. Nuclear may be cheap after establishment, but it just costs too much for developing countries to establish. A wind farm in Kern County, California costs $1.2 billion to establish, and it produces 1,320 megawatts. A nuclear reactor in Burke County, Georgia produces 2,430 megawatts of energy, so we'd imagine it would be a little less than the cost, right? Well, try 16 times more expensive. This just goes to show that nuclear is too expensive for developing countries to afford. There are high construction costs due to complex radiation containment systems and procedures. High subsidies needed for construction and operation, as well as loan guarantees. Interest, which increase the consumer cost, or taxes. But why taxes? The government has to subsidize. Waivers are required to limit liability of companies in the event of an accident. This means that either no one will be responsible for physical, environmental, or health damages in the case of an accident, or leakage over time from waste storage, or that the government will ultimately have to cover the cost of the damages. It's clear that nuclear is not a financially cheap option, nor is it as abundant as its counterparts.
Puts out CO2. And so, what we're going to have to do at a global scale is create a new system. And so we need energy miracles. Because we agree with Bill Gates, we affirm the resolution, the world cannot meet the demand for cheap, abundant energy without nuclear power. Nuclear energy is the miracle for three reasons. Firstly, nuclear energy has been coming down in cost. Second, nuclear energy produces a tremendous amount of energy. Lastly, nuclear energy is an extremely small carbon footprint. I think the first point we need to focus on is nuclear energy is cheap. While recognizing the construction process requires a huge upfront capital hit, the costs tumble once the plant is operating. According to Mark Halper, over 60 years, nuclear power plants have a 90% probability that the total cost would stay within the range of $77 to $99 per megawatt hour, a range of 22 megawatt hours. But gas power plants have a 90% probability that the total cost would stay within the range of 64 to 103 megawatt hours, a range of 39 megawatt hours, or almost double of nuclear's range. Not to mention that the lifetime of a nuclear power plant is 60 years, while the lifetime for a gas power plant is 30 years. Also, for those who believe nuclear fuel is expensive, nuclear fuel contributes to 10% of the cost of a nuclear reactor project. Compared to oil, natural gas, and coal, nuclear fuel costs are substantially lower. Oil is 17 cents more expensive than per kilowatt hour than nuclear fuel. Natural gas is 3 cents more expensive, and coal is 2 cents more expensive per kilowatt hour, according to the NEI, or Nuclear Energy Institute. The levelized cost in 2012 per megawatt hour for plants entering service in 2018 for advanced nuclear is $108.4. For advanced coal, it's $123. For incredibly green and cheap technology, wind is $221.5 and solar PV is $144.3, according to the Energy Information Administration. The second point that makes nuclear the most appealing energy source of the 21st century is the amount of energy nuclear reactors produce. Currently, nuclear reactors generate about 13% of the world's electricity as continuous, reliable, base load power, and their efficiency is increasing. One fission reaction produces 200 mega-electron volts. The average nuclear power plant in the United States generates about 12.2 billion kilowatt hours. The United States currently uses 3,839 billion kilowatt hours per energy per year. That means that if the United States constructed 211 reactors along with the 104 currently operating nuclear reactors in the U.S. would be completely nuclear energy. Now, I'm not saying we should build 211 reactors, but if we only constructed 56 more Generation 3 plus nuclear reactors, nuclear energy would supply the U.S. with just over a half of the energy it currently needs. If this step was taken to a more nuclear energy-dependent country, the U.S.'s carbon footprint would drop dramatically from what it is today. Today, solar, wind, and geothermal technologies will someday supply the total amount of energy needed by the U.S. Today, to say solar, wind, and geothermal technology will someday supply the total amount of energy needed by the U.S. is stretching your credibility. Solar only produces 0.08% of the U.S.'s energy, wind 0.31%, geothermal 0.35%. Together, that's only 0.7% of the total energy required by the U.S. today. The last point we need to focus on is nuclear energy's small carbon footprint. On average, each nuclear reactor in the U.S. produces 66.0 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Okay, you said uranium is finite. I agree, but according to the NEA, identified uranium resources total 5.5 million metric tons, and an additional 10.5 million metric tons remain undiscovered. A roughly 230-year supply at today's consumption rate in total. Further exploration, improvements, and extraction technology are likely to at least double this estimate over time. So by you saying that nuclear is finite, I agree with you, but it's not as finite as coal or natural gas as we know right now. And the lifetime nuclear has right now is incredible compared to coal and natural gas.
The problem with the uranium that you're talking about is that many indigenous tribes live on this uranium, and they're not willing to give up their lands simply to allow other countries, especially these well-developed countries, to essentially dig up their homes and take the uranium. We saw the documentary about the Keystone Atoll, and it shows that many citizens there are upset, and their only aspirations are to go home, to which they can no longer go. So destroying people's homes isn't a very viable solution. And
I agree. Destroying people's homes is awful. I don't think we should move indigenous tribes off where they live currently. But also, there's also something called fast breeder reactors, which I'm sure you know of, which you take the spent fuel, which we have tons of uranium-238, and use that, process it, and take it as energy. And I understand that there are uranium underneath certain places where we shouldn't mine, but right now there is a tremendous amount of fuel that's untapped, and plus the uranium-235 that's also untapped that we can utilize right now. So that argument may be true, but that's only in one scenario.
And in your scenario, the uranium and the spent fuel is even more finite. And you were talking about making many nuclear plants and these fast reactors, but that costs money. And you were talking about this in the U.S., and whether it's 200 or 56, the U.S. simply does not have that money right now. And beyond the U.S., developing countries don't have this money right now. And we need to look at the world. The scope of this revolution is the world. So how are we going to help these third world countries if we can't help ourselves in the U.S.? And even if we're not even focusing on the U.S. or the European Union, let's focus on a third world country. How are we going to give them energy?
First of all, you keep saying nuclear is expensive, which I clearly refuted in this speech. It's not expensive. You do the numbers and you punch it. After the reactor is running, the cost dies down immediately, drastically. All the energy produced from a nuclear reactor will eliminate that cost in a fraction amount of time. Plus, you're saying that solar and wind is so viable. First of all, solar and wind aren't base load technology, so you don't know when that energy is going to come, and because of that, you can't run a country on solar and wind.
So first and foremost, I'd like to ask the question: where do you propose we get the money for that startup, for the startup in the United States or any place for a nuclear station? It costs a lot of money, right? And we're already in debt. But anyways, so I'll move on. The economics of nuclear energy and its bang for buck has always been like a hot topic, and we don't really know if we should invest tens of billions of dollars in plants, or even if it's worth it, because all the drilling machinery and all the different transportation machinery we use are very, very costly. So the answer isn't very clear, but first and foremost, I'd like to nag on the capital cost idea. That's our first contention. So for example, in 2008, according to the Southern Nuclear Company, which is a company based out in southern Texas, the Georgia Power Company, which is a branch of that, built 2 nuclear power plants for nearly $17 billion. It was $14 billion originally, plus $3 billion in upgrades because they didn't properly secure something. The security of the radioactivity, the radiation wasn't very secure. But that's not the point. Both reactors had a combined capacity of 2430 megawatts. I'm pretty sure my partner mentioned that. And so, $17 billion for 2430 megawatts. On the other hand, when we look at the Clean Energy Action Project, which was a wind farm in Kern County, California, which was installed in the 80s and 90s, that cost only a mere $1.2 billion for a 1320 megawatt wind power. I believe Mike mentioned that it was 16 times as cost effective. I'm not saying all wind farms are 16 times as cost effective as nuclear, but I'm just 2 cases, just side by side. So all I'm trying to say is it is possible for wind farms to be much, much more cheap and cost effective than nuclear power plants. That's just one instance. My second contention questions the supposed abundance of uranium and other fissionable material. So even with I'm just going to compare with coal first. Okay, so nuclear is still outmatched when it compares to coal because there's roughly 1,041 million tons of usable coal left, whereas you mentioned was it like 5 million tons of identified uranium, right, and then like 10 million or something unidentified uranium, right, as opposed to that, right? But then even with that, we don't have to just depend on coal. I mean, our resolution that doesn't state that CO2 emissions or climate change is a factor here. We're just talking about cheapness and abundance. So I'm going to focus on the abundant part. If we combine all our resources, the infinite sun, the wind that will constantly be there someplace in the world, maybe not necessarily everywhere, but someplace in the world has that wind because there's always a change in air pressure, right? Change in temperature. So I'm saying if we combine all those efforts, we can definitely see that the abundance is there. The abundance is there. And then last but not least, I'd like to bring up the point. There's a company called Vestas. They're a global wind energy company. They specialize in offshore and onshore wind turbines. And so they say that offshore turbines produces more net electricity, roughly 3 times as much as onshore turbines. And so my point is, the efficiency of these turbines can be improved, and we can create as many as we want. Because they use the example that in the North Sea, which is which I'm sure you're aware, offshore wind farms cover 10% of the North Sea, and they were apparently able to generate electricity equivalent to the total annual consumption of the 27 countries in is basically all of Europe. 10% of the North Sea, they used offshore wind farms. They were able to power all of Europe. So what I'm trying to say is, North Sea is a fraction of the size of the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. So why can't we work on investing in offshore wind and stuff like that, which is cheaper than the startup costs for nuclear, as I pointed out earlier, and definitely abundant in terms of space and resources. And in that sense, if we invest in more efficient solar and wind ideas, or wind ideas in this one, I'll move on to that. I'm not trying.
Alright, to get started right off the bat, there's been a lot of talk with wind and solar energy as a solution, as opposed to nuclear as a cheap replacement source. few points on that. First of all, in this round, we will be focusing on baseload power generation, as baseload power generation is really what is cheap and abundant energy that most people are looking for, as baseload makes up over 2/3 of the energy that we actually use on a daily basis. And wind and solar, since they're not a continuous and constant amount of energy given out, it's not a smooth line of the amount of energy. There's peaks and dips as the amount of energy generated from the wind and solar plant, as the sun is not always shining at its brightest and the wind is not always moving at its fastest. It really only makes up a small fraction of the energy we use, and it's what is known as peak or intermediate load. So this baseload power is really what we should be focusing on in this round. Furthermore on that, it's really a logical fallacy that this array of infinite wind, infinite solar, because you can't just hold out a few wires to gather the sunlight, or hold out a few wires to gather the wind. You have to build the technology, you have to build the plants to actually gather it. So you don't just have infinite energy from the sun whenever you want. That's not something that we'll be saying in this round, and that's the thing that they've been trying to make it sound like throughout their speeches. Now, furthermore, they've been talking about offshore wind and how there's plenty of wind offshore and there's plenty of land offshore that we can use. First of all, offshore wind is incredibly expensive. Maintenance and production costs of wind turbines that are not on land are much, much more expensive than on land. The ones on land, according to World Nuclear Association and the OECD, that onshore wind capacity costs generally between $1,821 to $3,760 per kilowatt, whereas nuclear can actually cost significantly less. For example, in China, it only costs about $1,748 per kilowatt hour, and in the U.S. only $1,556. And when you think of that, that's just onshore wind, so offshore wind is incredibly more expensive. So it is most assuredly not cheaper, and as it's not a baseload power generation, which is not abundant as well. Now, moving on to why nuclear is such a good idea, they also said there's not exactly a massive abundance of uranium. But when you take into account these new fast breeder reactors, we have in fact almost 20,000 years worth of uranium. That's not even talking about the thorium fuel cycle, which is an entire another system that is just as much or even more. So now, when you take all these into consideration, you can see why things like solar and wind really just don't stack up against nuclear, as one, they're not as cheap, and two, they're not nearly as abundant due to the amount of resources you have to put into actually gathering this infinite energy and things like that. So now, moving on to why coal is not necessarily better than nuclear power. According to a 2010 OECD study, the projected cost of general electricity compared to 2009 data for generating baseload electricity by 2015, as well as cost of power from renewables, and showed that nuclear power was very competitive at $30 per ton CO2 cost and low discount rate. The study comprised data from 190 power plants from 17 OECD countries, as well as some data from Brazil, China, Russia, and South Africa. It used levelized lifetime cost and carbon price of internalized OECD only to discount cash flow 5% and 10% as previously. The precise competitiveness of different baseload technologies depends very much on local circumstances, the cost of financing fuels. However, at this discount rate, nuclear is comfortably cheaper than coal and gas with all countries. So now, since it's clearly cheaper, moving on to why it is much more abundant, as I stated earlier, we have almost 20,000 years worth of uranium left, and about 150
Be like startup, where you said like the cost, startup cost. So basically, nuclear is a high risk industry. You know, if you don't know if it's gonna fail, if it's gonna succeed. I mean, I'll just read this. Construction.
What do you know it might fail?
Like something could go wrong, disaster.
Like a disaster?
Yeah. Or I mean, there's also nuclear. There's maintenance, right? So there's downtime. It takes about a month. So fuel rods and stuff like that, and downtime. So basically, with that in mind, it's high risk, and therefore there will be a higher interest rate because loaners will be more wary about just handing out money to something that may or may not 100% successful.
Isn't that why the government gives out the loan guarantees?
Right, and that's also why we're in such a big debt.
Is from empowering nuclear.
No, but from just handing out loans, right? So it's you should be smart with your money, actually.
I don't think that's the problem.
Well, My point is, as a result, if you increase, I'm just hypothetical, if you increase the rate from say 5% to 10%, for example, you would increase the total cost by roughly 50%, as opposed to like coal, for example. If you do the same change in interest rate, it'll only increase from 25%, or increase by 25%. So in the long term, coal is a much safer investment than nuclear energy.
Okay, so let me get this straight. You're saying that people are more likely to invest in coal as a cheaper resource because it's a less risky investment? Yeah. Alright. I really agree with the fact is that it's not nuclear energy that you're talking about there, it's the hand-nuclear nuclear energy. So what you're essentially saying is that because there's a potential risk in that there's a lot of upfront cost that people aren't going to be investing in nuclear energy. So that's not necessarily talking about the abundance and cheapness of nuclear energy itself. It's talking about the willingness of people to invest in it, which is completely different from the fact that it is in fact cheaper in the long run. It just seems scarier because it has to pay the upfront cost. Now, I have a question for you. You mentioned a lot about third world countries in Mike's last speech. Would you consider South Africa to be included in that third world country? No. Alright. Would you identify it as a poorer country just in general?
Not a poor, I think maybe it's developing.
So it is.
It has potential.
Alright. So they were saying to nuclear power plants using the significant effect of the poor country has to go into everything?
No, well, they're not a poor country. They just don't have the technology.
Okay.
Well, they're working on it. Anyways, so you mentioned.
So there was a lot of talk about if spouse energy, that some other source will have to pick this all up, or there was a lot of emphasis on solar and wind will have to pick all this up. However, this isn't true. There are many sources which are cheaper than nuclear that can pick it up. It's like dividing something very big against the very many. It's very there's very little out of each other. You need only a little bit of difference to pick up the slack. According to the U.S. average levelized cost for plants entering service in 2017, the 2010 results showed that conventional coal, advanced coal, natural gas, and geothermal, biomass, wind, and hydro are cheaper. Granted, solar photovoltaics and solar thermal are not. However, a space solar program can be implemented, and energy can be supplied back to the Earth. Secondly, there was talk of risk. Now, risk for a nuclear plant, a meltdown, well, risk for any major accident in a nuclear facility is a little less than 0.5% in the next 400 reactors. In the U.S., that's a little less than 4 years. Now, if you take, and with this little chance of great harm, we don't want to take that risk. And it's represented in our everyday lives. Imagine an airline. You go on this airline, you have a safe flight from New York to LA, and afterwards you find out that, oh, the emergency exit door wasn't working. The flight attendants knew this, of course. They just didn't tell you because the probability of this plane crashing, very low. The public would be outraged. Would you be outraged if the same risk was taken with nuclear material, radioactive material that takes years and years to clean up? The San Francisco plane that just crashed may take a month to clean up, but this takes years and years. Some of this waste can last hundreds of thousands of years, 500,000 years, millions of years. This is just too great a risk. Okay.
We're talking about cheap and abundant energy. Cheap, abundant energy with or without nuclear power. So I don't know what thing to do it. Regarding Ani's statement about wind power, 29 countries in Europe. Well, France uses 80% nuclear power. So I don't know where you're getting that statistic, but I do not think that's true. Regarding Mike, when talking about wind power, they just installed 3 large wind turbines in Clifton Well. One has already failed, and the other 2 only produce 10% of the potential output. And let's remember, it's not base load technology.
Regarding risk in nuclear, you're talking about Generation 1 and Generation 2 reactors. Well, most Generation 1 reactors are being shut down. Most Generation 2 reactors are trying to be made more efficient and safer. And Generation 3, which we're actually looking into right now, is adopting a technology called passive safety, where if something were to happen, the risk of if something were to happen within the nuclear reactor, it would most likely nothing will happen in a nuclear reactor. What I've seen in many studies is they say that they could leave the reactor alone for 3 days and nothing would happen. As regard to solar, again, it's not baseload. You're not presenting an idea that will refute nuclear. You're just refuting nuclear. You're not showing us any way that another technology is useful in any sense. Yes, okay, and you're talking about waste and all this nuclear waste. Well, they have fast breeder reactors right now. They're going to take that waste, uranium-238, which there are literally a desert, like a whole area filled of just 238 spent fuel that they're then going to use to acquire more and more energy. Yeah, like I said, solar only produces 1% no, not even, less than 1% within the U.S. currently. So I don't see that as a viable option to replace nuclear energy.
So pertaining to the last comment, where solar was less than 1%. Well, I have
In the United States.
In the United States, okay. The U.S. isn't the whole world, and we're looking at the whole world here. And referring to one of your rebuttal points, a Generation 1 reactor was never mentioned in our argument.
You never mentioned any generation.
You cited that you did. And you also cited that
You were talking
3
about
wind turbines had failed recently. Now, if we're going to take these wind farms or wind turbines?
Sorry, Joe.
Okay, so these wind turbines failed, and you're using this to, say wind power is bad. But if we're going to pick 3 failures, then I'm going to pick Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. So we're not really going to do that. We're going to look at it as a whole. And when there's a problem with the wind turbine, there may be a little bit loss of energy and some damage, but a problem.
How much does it cost? How much does it cost to take a repairman to go up there and fix the wind turbine? You never told us how much wind actually costs, especially in the offshore. You said it was we said it was 3 times more, but you never actually provided any cost. So you're telling us that yes, wind is cheap, but you're not providing any numbers whatsoever. I haven't heard any. I don't think you can do any. No, I haven't heard any numbers whatsoever. So right now, until we hear some numbers, your argument is valid.
Nuclear energy, the cost in euros per megawatt hour,
That's
is 107.0 to 124.0 euros. And the only thing more expensive than this in the list I'm about to read you is solar electricity. What's less than it is biomass, 77.1 to 115.5. With my source, UN data.
Okay.
So then we have hydropower, 34.7 to 126.7, and I can go on. And on this list is brown coal, black coal, domestic gas, wind energy, onshore wind energy, offshore. And if you look at, if you keep looking at it, you can see levelized capital costs, the fixed O&M, operation and management, and capacity factors. And the only things that nuclear is beating is solar, photovoltaics, solar thermal, and advanced coal with CCS. There are many other categories that can pick up what nuclear
Alright,
can.
so I think I understand what you're saying, but that is it's not necessarily factoring in how so the nuclear reactors, they overall their cost is cheaper than looking at just basic power generation. And also, as I stated earlier, it's very cost effective on the specific location, as you mentioned, Europe. Yeah, it's probably more cost effective to make wind and solar there, as there are plenty of solar. But in other places, nuclear is subscribing to the whole world. Other places, nuclear is much more cost effective, like I mentioned, as in China and in the US. So, let's take that into consideration.
first and foremost, you bring up, you're saying that countries like China and stuff in Europe were like had a much cheaper cost for nuclear, like payment. So we actually have a chart of like the estimated levelized cost of new generation resources. So it says roughly $83.3 US per megawatt. This is after 2010, by the way. $83.3 US per megawatt hour for wind. Advanced nuclear at $88.8 US per megawatt hour. Conventional coal had $65.8 US per megawatt hour, and advanced coal had 75.2. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here, but I think this was an IEA report.
You don't have to respond.
And then I also like to bring up the fact that we're going to look at this as a holistic process. We're not just going to look at China, we're just going to look at the United States, we're not going to look at Europe, we're going to look at the whole thing. And so there are countries who don't possess billions of dollars. And so like I mentioned earlier, the down payment for a nuclear reactor is very, very high. For example, the $17 billion farm in Kern County. So if you're thinking countries like Ethiopia just third world countries are going to be able to invest $17 billion into things like nuclear power. I don't see how that's going to be a cheap energy source for their energy demand. Whereas if you go more reasonable, like $1.2 billion, it's 17 times less, right? And obviously Ethiopia is not going to be using as much power as the United States. That's common sense. You don't really need facts for that, right? So I'm just trying to say that the investment for alternate options such as wind and mostly wind is much less and much more feasible. So in that sense, it definitely addresses the problem in that it's much cheaper. I'd also like to address, we kind of like sheared off the finite topic. I think that even though we have a lot of uranium available, the potential for solar and wind is much cheaper.
Essentially this last speech was around. I think it's important to get back to what exactly the resolution is asking us about. It's asking about, is nuclear a cheap and abundant enough resource to be competitive with other kinds of energy in the world? The answer to that is in fact yes. So now, looking back around what we've already said, focusing on the cheaper side, it really has been a battle of evidence at this point. So we've had evidence that says nuclear is cheaper. They've had evidence saying that wind or like coal is cheaper. So really, you can't just go off of what the numbers are saying. But overall, if you look at maybe hundreds, even maybe 1,000 years into the future, we've been over this that when you look at the abundance, that becomes the more important factor in this round. They claim that there's an infinite amount of solar energy, an infinite amount of wind energy. Well, we have plenty of uranium to go around for the next 20,000, even more years, which really has not been something they've reviewed. So, if you look 20,000 years into the future, there's no way to even predict what could possibly happen to the world outside. Maybe we don't even live on this planet anymore. Maybe we have other resources. Maybe we have another planet full of resources. We can't predict that far in the future. So when you're looking at the cheapness and just becomes a battle of evidence, you can't really tell who's right just based on what's happening in this round. But what we can tell you is when it comes to abundance and base load power generation, that uranium is much more abundant than coal, much more abundant than natural gas, which are really the only other two forms of base load power generation. They brought up the whole space-based solar power thing, but that's, to be honest, it's a little bit absurd. The amount of material you have to get into space is much larger than anything that we could possibly do. So when you look at base load power generation, really nuclear is the only viable option when it comes to abundance.